Imagine a place so cut off from the rest of the living world that the plants growing across its hills, the trees twisting above its valleys, and the strange alien shapes rising from its rocky soil cannot be found anywhere else on the entire planet. Not anywhere in Africa, not in South America, not in Asia, not on any other island sitting anywhere in any ocean. A place where the nearest mainland coastline sits hundreds of kilometers away across open water, where the winds blow off an ocean so vast and so unbroken that the air itself carries a kind of wildness you cannot find anywhere more connected to the rest of Earth's landmass. A place where the people who live there have built an entire way of life shaped, generation after generation, by the profound fact of their isolation, and where that isolation has produced not just extraordinary landscapes and extraordinary plants, but an extraordinary culture that continues today, quietly, stubbornly, and with remarkable depth. This is Socotra, an island in the Arabian Sea belonging to Yemen, and before we travel any further into this story, if places this remote, this genuinely unlike anywhere else on Earth, genuinely fascinate you the way they fascinate us, go ahead and subscribe right now, because today we are going deep into exactly how life actually works for the people who call this singular island home. Turn on notifications as well, because there are many more journeys like this one still ahead, and you will not want to miss where we head next. Socotra sits in the northwestern Indian Ocean, positioned where the Arabian Sea meets the Gulf of Aden, roughly 240 kilometers east of the Horn of Africa, and about 350 kilometers south of the Arabian Peninsula. Yemen administers the island as part of the Socotra Archipelago Governorate, though the mainland of Yemen itself remains a considerable distance away, across open, frequently rough water. The island measures approximately 3,600 square kilometers, making it the largest island in the Arabian Sea, and yet, despite that considerable size, it holds a population of somewhere around 70,000 people, a density that leaves enormous stretches of its dramatic interior landscape almost entirely empty of human settlement. It is a place big enough to contain genuine geographic diversity, rugged mountain ranges rising sharply from flat coastal plains, expansive sandy deserts of brilliant white dunes meeting the sea along its northern coast, dense tropical woodland clinging to wetter highland valleys, and a coastline of extraordinary beauty stretching across its southern and eastern edges, yet small enough that its isolation has been essentially total for most of its recorded history. The island's geology tells the beginning of its story. Socotra was once connected, many millions of years ago, to what is now the Arabian Peninsula and the broader landmass of the ancient supercontinent Gondwana, before the movement of tectonic plates gradually separated it from the surrounding mainland, leaving it stranded in the sea over a time span measured in tens of millions of years. This geological separation is the single most important fact about Socotra's natural history, because it means that while the rest of the world's plants and animals continued evolving in contact with each other, exchanging genetic material, competing and adapting across broad continental and regional scales, the living things marooned on Socotra were left to evolve entirely on their own, following their own separate evolutionary trajectories for an almost incomprehensible length of time. The result is a natural world of breathtaking strangeness, a place where the flora and fauna have diverged so dramatically from anything found elsewhere that scientists have compared walking through it to visiting another planet entirely, or perhaps to stepping into a world where evolution followed an entirely different set of instructions than the ones it used everywhere else. The numbers alone are staggering. Approximately 37% of Socotra's plant species are endemic to the island, meaning they exist nowhere else on Earth, a proportion of unique flora that puts Socotra among the most botanically extraordinary places anywhere in the world. More than 825 plant species have been recorded across the island and its associated smaller islands, and of those, somewhere around 307 are found absolutely nowhere else. Many of these plants look like nothing familiar to anyone arriving from a more connected part of the world, with shapes and forms that seem to belong to a different evolutionary logic entirely, producing trees that look like they might belong in a science fiction landscape, shrubs that produce resins prized for centuries across the ancient world, and flowers whose colors, structures, and pollinators tell stories of millions of years of isolated coevolution playing out without any connection to the rest of the planet. No single plant captures Socotra's alien quality more completely than the dragon's blood tree, known scientifically as Dracaena cinnabari, a species so visually distinctive that photographs of it have circled the world many times over, stunning viewers who struggle to believe it is genuinely real. The dragon's blood tree grows with a thick, pale gray trunk that branches repeatedly upward into a dense, flat-topped canopy described universally as resembling an enormous inside-out umbrella, or perhaps a vast mushroom cast in dark green. The canopy is so dense and so precisely horizontal that rain falling on it simply runs outward along the leaves and drips from the edges, effectively channeling water away from the base of the trunk in a dry environment where every drop of moisture matters. The tree bleeds a deep, striking red resin when cut, a resin that has been harvested by Socotra people for thousands of years and traded across the ancient world, prized variously as a dye, a medicine, a varnish, a ritual substance, and a cosmetic ingredient, appearing in trade records from ancient Greece, Rome, India, and the wider Arabian world. Forests of dragon's blood trees cover parts of the island's highland plateau in such numbers that the landscape they create genuinely has no visual equivalent anywhere else on Earth. A canopy of hundreds of overlapping flat umbrellas spread across rocky, misty hillsides in a scene so strange and so beautiful that it defies easy description. The cucumber tree, Dendrosychios socotranus, represents another of the island's botanical wonders, a species so entirely unique that it belongs to a plant genus found nowhere else in the world. It grows a dramatically swollen, bottle-shaped trunk, from which thin branches extend upward and outward, carrying leaves and small yellow flowers that would look quite ordinary if they were growing from any other base, producing an overall effect of delightful absurdity, a fat, bulging tree body, topped with vegetation that looks like it arrived from a different species entirely. The tree uses its swollen trunk to store water, an evolutionary adaptation to the island's seasonal aridity, a solution arrived at independently from similar strategies employed by plants in completely unrelated environments elsewhere in the world. A beautiful example of convergent evolution, producing similar answers to similar problems across entirely separated lineages. The desert rose, Adenium obesum socotranum, another endemic species, takes the swollen trunk strategy even further, growing forms that look less like any conventional idea of a plant and more like fantastical abstract sculptures, with enormously distended bases tapering upward into branching structures that produce brilliant pink and white flowers of considerable beauty, entirely at odds with the almost grotesque extremity of their supporting trunks. Frankincense trees, several species of Boswellia unique to Socotra, contribute their own distinctive perfume to the highland air, tapping into a resin-producing tradition that connected Socotra to the ancient frankincense trade routes running across the Arabian Peninsula and into the Mediterranean world, thousands of years before anyone thought to document the island's extraordinary natural history in systematic terms. Beyond its plants, Socotra's wildlife tells the same story of profound isolation producing remarkable uniqueness. The island has its own endemic species of birds found nowhere else on Earth, including the Socotra sunbird, the Socotra starling, and the Socotra cisticola, alongside numerous species of reptile that evolved on the island in complete isolation from their closest relatives found on distant continents. Socotra's island endemic reptiles include several species of chameleon and gecko that quietly go about their ancient lives on rocky hillsides and in the canopy of dragon's blood forests, entirely unaware of how extraordinary their own existence appears to any biologist fortunate enough to encounter them. The surrounding ocean waters support remarkable marine biodiversity as well, with coral reefs, whale sharks, diverse fish communities, and dolphin populations benefiting from the relatively pristine marine environment surrounding an island whose limited human population and traditional fishing practices have, at least historically, left the surrounding sea in considerably better condition than many more heavily exploited coastal environments around the world. UNESCO recognized all of this by inscribing Socotra as a World Natural Heritage Site in 2008, one of only a small number of sites inscribed specifically for their exceptional natural value, placing Socotra in the same category of globally significant natural places as the Galapagos Islands, the Amazon, and the Great Barrier Reef. For the people who live on Socotra, this recognition carries genuine significance, though it also brings with it the complexities that come whenever international recognition and conservation ambitions intersect with the daily realities and practical needs of a local population building their lives in the middle of extraordinary natural surroundings. To understand the people of Socotra, it helps to understand something of the remarkable deep history that the island carries. Human habitation of Socotra stretches back at least 3,000 years, and possibly considerably longer, with the island's position astride ancient Indian Ocean trade routes, giving it an importance in the ancient maritime world that its current profile might not immediately suggest. Ancient Greek and Roman sources mention the island, referring to it as a source of aloe, frankincense, and other valued aromatics and medicines. Indian Ocean merchants, Arabian traders, and later monsoon sailors from across the wider region all recognized Socotra as a significant waypoint and source of valuable natural products, placing this otherwise remote island at the intersection of some of the ancient world's most important commercial networks for a span of many centuries. A cave on the island's northeastern coast was found to contain inscriptions and graffiti left by ancient sailors and travelers in no fewer than 13 different scripts and languages, including Indian, South Arabian, Greek, Ethiopic, and Palmyrene. Remarkable testimony to the diversity of travelers who passed through or stopped at Socotra's shores across the ancient period, each leaving their mark in stone before sailing onward. The population of Socotra today speaks the Socotri language, a South Semitic language, closely related to, but distinct from Arabic, belonging to the modern South Arabian language family that also includes several other languages spoken in small pockets of the southern Arabian Peninsula. Crucially, Socotri has historically been an entirely oral language, with no indigenous writing system, a fact that has made its preservation both more challenging and more dependent on active, conscious transmission from one generation to the next through spoken practice, storytelling, poetry, song, and the daily conversational life of Socotri communities. Socotri poetry represents a particularly rich and valued oral tradition, with complex verse forms memorized and performed at social gatherings, celebrating the island's landscape, its plants and animals, its historical events, and the values of its communities in ways that have served as the primary vehicle for cultural memory across many generations, in the absence of written records. Arabic serves as the language of formal education, religion, government, and broader communication with the Yemeni mainland and the wider Arab world, meaning that most Socotri people are bilingual, moving between their ancient indigenous language and Arabic depending on context, in a pattern that mirrors bilingual communities in many other places where a small language community lives within a larger dominant language framework. The ethnic and cultural background of the Socotri population reflects the island's long history as a crossroads of Indian Ocean trade and migration, with ancestry tracing back to various combinations of South Arabian, African, Indian, and other sources, producing a population whose physical appearance and cultural practices reflect this long-accumulated diversity, while simultaneously developing a distinctly Socotri identity shaped by centuries of shared island life and the particular environmental and social conditions of this extraordinary place. Islam is the religion of the vast majority of Socotri people today, following the introduction of Islamic faith to the island in the early medieval period, though the specific practice of Islam on Socotra reflects the island's own cultural filtering processes, incorporating elements specific to local tradition and reflecting the island's geographic distance from the major centers of Islamic scholarship and practice on the Arabian Peninsula. The traditional economy of Socotra has historically rested on three interconnected foundations: fishing, animal herding, and the harvesting of the island's remarkable natural products, each reflecting a different facet of the island's geographic and ecological character, and each carrying its own set of practices, knowledge, traditions, and cultural meanings passed down across generations of Socotri families. Fishing has always represented the dominant livelihood for communities living along Socotra's extensive coastline, which stretches across some 1,200 kilometers of shores facing the Arabian Sea and offering access to the rich, productive waters that surround the island. Traditional Socotri fishermen have worked these waters using wooden fishing vessels, knowledge of seasonal fish movements tied directly to the island's dramatic monsoon cycle, and techniques for targeting various fish species refined across many generations of accumulated practical experience. The island's waters support significant populations of kingfish, grouper, tuna, snapper, and various other commercially and nutritionally valuable species, and fish has historically formed the primary protein source in the Socotri diet along coastal communities, prepared in ways that reflect the island's culinary traditions, including dried and preserved fish that could be stored and consumed during seasons when fishing conditions were too rough to permit regular trips offshore. The monsoon is the single most important environmental force shaping life on Socotra, arriving annually between approximately June and September as the powerful southwest monsoon sweeps across the Indian Ocean, battering the island with winds so strong and seas so rough that all maritime activity essentially halts completely for 3 to 4 months each year. During the monsoon season, Socotra is effectively cut off from the rest of the world, with the rough seas making boat travel dangerous or impossible, and air travel also severely disrupted by the persistent strong winds and poor visibility that characterize this period. This annual enforced isolation is not an occasional emergency or an unusual disruption. It is simply the predictable, reliable rhythm of the year on Socotra, a rhythm that the island's population has organized its entire way of life around for as many generations as anyone can count. Food stores must be adequate. Boat maintenance must be completed beforehand. Social and ceremonial calendars are structured around the season's constraints and opportunities. The monsoon is not something that happens to Socotra's people from outside. It is woven into the very fabric of how life there is organized and understood. During the monsoon period, interior communities that rely on herding become temporarily more central to the island's social and economic life, as grazing conditions across the island's highlands improve dramatically with the arrival of monsoon moisture, allowing the goat and cattle herds that many inland families maintain to feed well on the fresh growth that the rains produce across the rocky highland pastures. Goat herding represents the cornerstone of the traditional subsistence economy for Socotri communities living in the island's interior mountains, where the steep terrain, rocky soils, and seasonal water availability make the raising of goats and cattle more practical than settled agriculture as a primary means of feeding families across generations. Socotri herders move their animals across the island's dramatic landscape following seasonal grazing patterns, staying in caves or portable shelters during extended herding trips, and maintaining the kind of intimate, practically applied knowledge of the island's geography, water sources, and grazing conditions that can only be built across many generations of careful observation and accumulated practical experience. The harvesting of plant-based natural products represents the third traditional economic pillar, connecting Socotri communities to the ancient trade networks through which dragon's blood resin, aloe, frankincense, and other island botanical products reached markets across the Arabian world, East Africa, India, and beyond for many centuries. These harvesting traditions required their own specific knowledge base, including knowing precisely which trees to tap, at what time of year, using what technique, and how to process and store the resulting resins and other products in ways that preserved their quality for trade or use. This knowledge, like so much of Socotra's traditional cultural heritage, was transmitted orally across generations, embedded within the daily practices and seasonal rhythms of families and communities whose livelihoods depended directly on applying it correctly. The dragon's blood resin, for example, is extracted by making careful cuts in the bark of mature trees during specific seasons, allowing the distinctive red sap to flow and harden into lumps that can then be collected and processed, a practice that has been carried out on Socotra for at least 2,000 or 3,000 years, connecting contemporary Socotri harvesters to a tradition of astonishing antiquity. Traditional Socotri housing reflects a centuries-old adaptation to the island's specific environmental conditions and the particular demands of a semi-nomadic herding lifestyle in the interior. Many traditional interior dwellings are built within natural caves, taking advantage of the island's abundant rocky terrain to create sheltered spaces that require minimal construction effort, while offering natural protection from the extreme heat of summer and the fierce winds of the monsoon season. Where caves are not available, traditional Socotri homes in the interior are often simple stone and mortar structures, low-walled and sturdy, built to withstand the wind while remaining cool in the heat, set within landscapes of dramatic rocky hills and dragon's blood tree forest that give Socotra's inhabited interior a character unlike any domestic landscape found anywhere else on Earth. Along the coast, traditional housing has historically taken somewhat different forms suited to the different environmental conditions of the shoreline, with more substantial structures in established fishing villages where communities maintained more permanent settlement patterns relative to the more mobile herding communities of the interior. The construction of more modern cement block housing has spread significantly across both coastal and interior communities in more recent decades, driven by the gradual increase in connections to the mainland and the greater availability of imported materials, resulting in a landscape where traditional stone dwellings and cave dwellings increasingly stand alongside newer construction, reflecting the ongoing negotiation between tradition and modernity that plays out across the island's daily life. Water has always been among the most critically important practical considerations shaping settlement patterns and daily life on Socotra, given the island's strongly seasonal rainfall pattern and the limited capacity of its terrain to store large volumes of water between rain events. Natural springs, seasonal streams, and rainwater collection have historically defined where communities could establish themselves and how large they could practically grow, with the limited freshwater of certain highland valleys and spring-fed coastal areas serving as primary settlement anchors across many generations of Socotra history. Traditional knowledge of the island's water sources, including detailed familiarity with spring locations, seasonal stream behavior, and the specific microenvironments where water could be reliably found during dry periods, formed another critical component of the accumulated practical wisdom that Socotra communities have maintained and transmitted for many generations as a matter of straightforward survival. Hadibo, the island's principal town and administrative center located along the northern coast, serves as the closest thing Socotra has to an urban center, housing a significant proportion of the island's total population, alongside the government offices, markets, schools, hospital, and commercial establishments that serve the broader island community. The town has grown significantly over recent decades as connections with the mainland have improved, drawing migration from rural interior communities seeking access to services, economic opportunities, and connection to the broader world that Hadibo's somewhat more connected position provides. Even so, by almost any global standard, Hadibo remains a small town, with an unhurried pace of life, strong neighborhood ties, and a social texture that reflects the island's overall character as a place where community bonds remain genuinely central to how daily life actually works. Markets in Hadibo bring together fishermen selling their catch, traders dealing in locally produced goods, vendors of imported food and supplies, and artisans selling various locally produced items, creating a commercial hub that connects the island's various communities and economic activities in one continuously active social space. The fish market in particular operates with the kind of purposeful energy found in fishing community markets everywhere in the world, a busy, aromatic, intensely practical space where the morning's catch is sold quickly, negotiations are brief and experienced, and the smell of the sea mixes with the smell of the island's extraordinary air in a combination specific to this place alone. The social structure of Socotra communities continues to reflect the deep importance of tribal and family affiliations that have organized island life for many centuries. Tribal identity remains meaningful in practical terms, shaping marriage patterns, dispute resolution processes, land use arrangements, and the social obligations and support networks that individual families can draw upon when needed. Tribal leaders and elders continue to play significant roles in community governance and conflict resolution, particularly in rural interior communities, where formal state administrative structures have historically had relatively limited day-to-day presence and practical authority, compared to the weight carried by traditional governance systems grounded in long-established social relationships and accumulated community trust. Marriage traditions on Socotra carry their own specific character, with celebrations that can extend across multiple days of feasting, music, and community gathering, reflecting both the significance attached to marriage as a social institution and the value placed on communal celebration as a means of reinforcing the bonds between families and the broader community. Traditional Socotra music, played on instruments including the oud and various percussion instruments, features at weddings and other celebrations, with musical forms and vocal styles specific to Socotra that reflect the island's South Arabian heritage, while also carrying distinctive local characteristics shaped by centuries of isolation and independent development. Poetry recitation plays a particularly significant role in Socotra celebrations and social gatherings, with respected poets performing complex verse compositions that draw on the island's natural imagery, cultural values, and historical memories in ways that reflect the enormous prestige that verbal artistry has historically held within Socotra culture. Women's daily lives on Socotra reflect the broader social values and practical realities of a traditionally conservative community embedded within a wider Yemeni and Islamic cultural context, with domestic work, childcare, food preparation, and the various crafts and practical skills associated with household and family management forming the primary domain of most women's daily activity, particularly in more rural communities. At the same time, Socotra women have historically been known for particular skills and knowledge traditions, including expertise in the medicinal and practical uses of the island's extraordinary plant biodiversity, carrying detailed knowledge of which plants treat which ailments, which resins have what properties, and how various natural materials can be processed and applied, in ways that reflect generations of accumulated botanical knowledge specific to this island's unique plant life. This practical botanical knowledge, held primarily by older women in many communities, represents a form of living cultural heritage of considerable scientific as well as cultural value, connecting contemporary Socotra families to thousands of years of accumulated understanding of the island's extraordinary natural pharmacy. Education on Socotra has expanded considerably in recent decades, with schools operating across various communities throughout the island providing access to Arabic language formal schooling for children who previously might have had very limited access to formal education at all. The expansion of education has brought significant changes to Socotra society, including rising literacy rates, changing expectations among younger generations about economic opportunities and life possibilities, and the gradual shift toward a more Arabic language-dominated public culture that has created complex dynamics around the preservation of the Socotra language and the oral cultural traditions it carries. For Socotra language and culture advocates, the education system's exclusive focus on Arabic represents a genuine long-term threat to the survival of Socotra as a living, actively spoken language, since children whose formal learning all happens in Arabic naturally develop stronger facility with that language and may find themselves less fluent in Socotra as a result, a pattern seen in communities where minority languages lack formal educational support in many other parts of the world as well. Healthcare on the island has historically been extremely limited, with the island's geographic isolation making access to medical care a persistent, serious challenge for the population. Traditional medicinal knowledge, drawing on the island's remarkable plant diversity, has historically served as the primary healthcare resource available to most Socotra families, with knowledge of plant-based treatments for common illnesses, infections, and injuries representing genuinely essential practical knowledge in a context where trained medical professionals and pharmaceutical supplies were essentially unavailable for most of the population for most of the island's history. The improvement of healthcare infrastructure in more recent decades, including hospitals and health centers in Hadibo and several other locations, represents a meaningful change in this long-standing situation, though the island continues to face significant challenges in maintaining consistent access to adequate medical care, given the ongoing combination of remoteness, limited infrastructure, and the various political and conflict-related disruptions that have affected Yemen and its territories in recent years. The political situation facing Socotra must be addressed directly, because it forms an absolutely essential part of understanding the reality of daily life on the island today. Yemen has been experiencing devastating armed conflict since the escalation of civil war beginning in 2015, a conflict involving multiple armed factions, significant foreign involvement, and humanitarian consequences that have made Yemen one of the most acute humanitarian crises in the world during the years in which this fighting has continued. Socotra's specific political situation has been further complicated by the island's strategic position in the Indian Ocean and by competition between various parties for influence over it, including UAE-backed forces that have had a significant presence on the island at various points, Saudi Arabia, and the internationally recognized Yemeni government, creating a complex, shifting political environment that sits uncomfortably alongside the island's extraordinary natural heritage and the daily lives of its 70,000 residents. For the people of Socotra, this political complexity and the broader conflict affecting mainland Yemen creates a very particular situation. The island has been spared much of the direct armed conflict that has devastated large parts of mainland Yemen, and the physical destruction that has affected cities and communities there has not been replicated on Socotra's shores in the same way. Nevertheless, the island's economy, its supply chains, and its connections to the outside world have all been significantly affected by the broader conflict context, with disruptions to shipping, aerial connections, and administrative functions carrying real, daily consequences for families whose access to imported food, medical supplies, fuel, and other necessities depends on those connections functioning reliably. The concern about Socotra's fate in the context of broader Yemeni and regional political dynamics has also prompted significant international attention from conservation organizations and international bodies, concerned that the island's extraordinary natural heritage might be vulnerable to inappropriate development or exploitation during a period when formal governance and protective oversight are both compromised by the surrounding conflict context. Access to Socotra from the outside world has historically been extremely limited, with seasonal commercial air connections providing the primary reliable link to the Yemeni mainland and beyond, supplemented by periodic cargo shipping during the months when the monsoon permits safe sea travel. The island received a paved road network only in the relatively recent past, with a road connecting Hadibo to other parts of the island not completed until the early years of the 21st century. A fact that illustrates how genuinely recent Socotra's physical connection to anything resembling modern infrastructure actually is. Before road construction, travel between different parts of the island required either boat travel around the coastline or extended, demanding overland journeys, on foot or by camel and donkey, across difficult terrain, a practical reality that reinforced the already considerable isolation felt by interior communities from both the coast and from any connection to the outside world. The arrival of more reliable air connections and infrastructure in the early 21st century began opening Socotra to a small but growing stream of adventure tourists, drawn by the island's extraordinary natural beauty, its alien plant life, and the opportunity to visit one of the genuinely most remote and least visited places on Earth. This nascent tourism economy, just beginning to develop when wider regional instability significantly disrupted it, offered both opportunities and concerns for Socotra's future, with the potential economic benefits of carefully managed ecotourism development set against the real risks of uncontrolled or poorly managed tourism, damaging the fragile ecosystems and cultural fabric that make the island worth visiting in the first place. For a period, small guest houses, camping operations, and guided tours of the Dragon's Blood tree forests and other natural sites were beginning to provide supplementary income for some island families, while also creating the first genuine organized local engagement with the possibility of a tourism economy as a sustainable component of the island's future. The potential of Socotra's tourism appeal is genuinely extraordinary, because there is essentially nothing else on Earth that looks or feels like what the island's extraordinary landscape offers. Walking through a forest of Dragon's Blood trees on the Dixum Plateau, with their perfect umbrella canopies spreading above and the ground beneath carpeted with plants that exist nowhere else, is an experience that defies comparison to any other natural environment. The white sand dunes of the Awamak and Zahek areas, where dunes of brilliant white quartz sand push against turquoise water beneath skies of impossible blue, create a visual spectacle of remarkable power. The granite peaks of the Hagir Mountains rising sharply from the coastal plain create dramatic vertical relief across a landscape that, elsewhere on the island, can seem almost horizontally endless. And everywhere, in every environmental zone from coast to highland, the evidence of millions of years of independent evolution presents itself in the form of plants and animals that look like nothing your eye has previously encountered, creating a genuine and profound experience of strangeness that most travelers, no matter how widely they have traveled, have never experienced anywhere else. The frankincense and dragon's blood resin harvesting traditions, mentioned earlier as ancient economic activities, continue to hold both practical and cultural significance for Socotri communities today, though the markets for these products and the economic structures around their harvesting and sale have changed considerably from the ancient trade route networks through which they once reached the wider world. Local use of dragon's blood resin as a traditional medicine continues, with knowledge of its applications for wound treatment, digestive complaints, and various other conditions remaining part of the practical household knowledge of many Socotri families. Commercial interest in dragon's blood resin for cosmetic and pharmaceutical applications internationally has also created a contemporary market value for the product, connecting the ancient practice of tapping these extraordinary trees to a global commercial marketplace in ways that raise both economic opportunity and conservation concern. Since uncontrolled harvesting of trees that are already vulnerable to changing climate conditions and habitat pressure could threaten the populations of an irreplaceable endemic species. The conservation challenges facing Socotra's extraordinary natural heritage are real, complex, and directly connected to the circumstances of the people who live there. The island's endemic plant species, evolved over millions of years of isolation, are not adapted to conditions that include heavy grazing pressure from large herds of imported animals, invasive plant species introduced from elsewhere, or the kind of infrastructure development that can destroy specific microhabitats where endemic plants depend on specific conditions of soil, moisture, and undisturbed ground conditions to survive. The goat herds that represent the traditional livelihood of many interior Socotra families, for example, create significant grazing pressure on endemic plant communities, since plants evolved in isolation often lack the defensive adaptations that plants from the mainland developed in response to millions of years of browsing pressure from large herbivores. This creates a genuine tension between conservation priorities and the legitimate livelihood needs of Socotra herding communities, a tension that does not have easy answers and requires careful, community-centered approaches to address sustainably. Invasive plant species represent another significant conservation concern, with various introduced plants spreading across disturbed habitats and competing with endemic species for space, water, and nutrients in ways that can gradually erode the biological uniqueness that makes Socotra so extraordinary. The development of infrastructure, including roads, buildings, and airport facilities, necessarily involves land clearance and habitat disturbance that carries direct ecological costs in an environment where every piece of intact habitat contains species found nowhere else on Earth. Managing these competing pressures requires governance capacity, conservation expertise, community engagement, and stable conditions that have all been made significantly more difficult by the ongoing political and conflict context affecting Yemen and Socotra in recent years. Climate change represents a profound long-term threat to Socotra's remarkable natural heritage, with projections suggesting significant changes to the monsoon patterns, temperature ranges, and sea level conditions that have shaped the island's ecology for millions of years. The dragon's blood trees in particular have already shown signs of stress in some populations, with reduced regeneration rates in certain areas suggesting that changing conditions are affecting the tree's ability to maintain healthy population structures over time. An island whose entire ecological distinctiveness was built across millions of years of stable isolation, producing species exquisitely adapted to very specific conditions, is potentially highly vulnerable to the kind of rapid environmental change that climate projections suggest. A vulnerability that gives Socotra's conservation challenges an urgency that goes well beyond ordinary concerns about habitat protection or invasive species management. Daily food life on Socotra reflects a blend of traditional patterns rooted in the island's own resources and the imported foods that have become increasingly available through improved connections to the mainland. Fish, prepared in a variety of ways, including dried, grilled, and cooked in various sauces and spice preparations that reflect both South Arabian and uniquely Socotra culinary traditions, remains the most important protein source for coastal communities, served alongside rice, which is largely imported, flatbreads, and various simple vegetable preparations. Interior herding communities have historically had a diet more centered on dairy products from their goat and cattle herds, including fresh milk, fermented milk products, and occasionally meat from animals slaughtered for celebrations or communal feasts. Dates, honey produced from bees visiting the island's extraordinary endemic flowering plants, and various locally gathered wild plant foods have also contributed to traditional Socotra diets in ways that directly connect the daily experience of eating to the extraordinary botanical landscape of the island itself. The honey produced on Socotra deserves particular attention because it represents one of the island's genuinely distinctive and highly valued traditional products, produced by indigenous Socotra bees that forage on the nectar of endemic flowering plants found nowhere else on Earth, creating a honey whose specific chemical composition and flavor profile is equally unique, shaped by the same extraordinary botanical diversity that makes the island's plant life so extraordinary to botanists and naturalists. Socotra honey has long been prized across the Arabian world for both its taste and its supposed medicinal properties, commanding premium prices in mainland markets and representing for many Socotra beekeeping families a valuable traditional product whose market value provides meaningful income while requiring no exploitation of the island's landscapes beyond the maintenance of the intact, healthy native plant communities that the bees depend on for their foraging. The social significance of coffee drinking in Socotra daily life reflects the wider Gulf and Arabian cultural context within which Socotra's contemporary culture is embedded, with coffee prepared and shared as a fundamental social ritual accompanying meetings, conversations, family visits, and business discussions in patterns closely connected to the broader coffee culture found across Yemen and the wider Arabian Peninsula. Tea drinking is similarly woven into the fabric of daily social interaction, with sweet, strongly brewed tea shared constantly throughout the day, as the social lubricant that accompanies virtually every form of human interaction, from casual neighborhood conversation to formal discussions between elders to the welcoming of guests into homes. A hospitality ritual that reflects the genuinely generous and welcoming character of Socotra communities toward visitors and strangers. The tradition of hospitality toward guests is deeply embedded in Socotra cultural values, reflecting both wider Arab cultural emphases on generous treatment of guests and specific island traditions of mutual support and care, rooted in the very real demands of managing life in an isolated environment, where community solidarity has always mattered practically as well as culturally. A visitor arriving in almost any Socotra community, whether in Hadibo or in a small interior herding settlement, reached after a long drive across rough mountain tracks, can expect to be offered food, tea, and conversation with a warmth and openness that reflects genuine cultural pride and hospitality rather than performance for outsiders. This generosity exists as a real and meaningful cultural value, maintained and practiced daily within Socotra communities, independent of any tourism or outside audience. One of the many aspects of Socotra cultural life that deserves recognition and respect on its own terms, rather than simply as a picturesque backdrop to the extraordinary natural landscape the island is famous for. The relationship between the Socotra language and the island's natural world is intimate and revealing, with a vocabulary for plants, animals, landscape features, weather patterns, and ecological phenomena that reflects thousands of years of careful, detailed observation of a specific natural environment by the people who live within it. Socotra has specific terms for dozens of endemic plant species, precise vocabulary for different monsoon conditions and wind patterns, and descriptive terms for landscape features and ecological phenomena that carry accumulated practical knowledge embedded directly within the structure of the language itself. The potential loss of this language would therefore represent not only a cultural catastrophe for the Socotra people themselves, but also a genuine scientific loss. The erasure of thousands of years of accumulated ecological knowledge about one of the world's most extraordinary and least studied natural environments, encoded in the vocabulary and oral traditions of a language that may leave no written record if it disappears. Efforts to document, preserve, and strengthen the Socotra language have been undertaken by various linguists, cultural heritage organizations, and Socotra cultural advocates, recognizing the urgent need to create recordings, dictionaries, and other documentation while fluent speakers remain available. The development of a written form of the Socotra language, something that has historically not existed, has been discussed and partially developed in recent decades, creating complex debates within the community about which script to use, how to represent specific sounds not present in Arabic, and how a written form would interact with the deeply oral tradition within which Socotra culture has always been rooted. These linguistic debates connect directly to broader questions about Socotra identity, cultural autonomy, and the relationship between Socotra communities and the wider Yemeni Arab political and cultural framework within which the island is administered. The schoolchildren of Socotra today grow up in a world dramatically different from the one their grandparents experienced, yet also connected to that earlier world through the living cultural practices, traditional knowledge, and environmental surroundings that continue to shape daily life in ways that no amount of modern connectivity can entirely displace. A child growing up in a coastal fishing family in Hadibo, or a smaller coastal settlement learns, from earliest memory, the rhythms of the sea and the monsoon, the names of fish and the methods of catching them, the importance of family and community bonds, and the presence of a natural world of extraordinary strangeness and beauty that forms the literal backdrop of every day of their childhood. A child growing up in an interior herding community learns the landscape of the Hagir Mountains with the intimate familiarity that comes from walking them regularly, learns the behavior of goats and the management of the traditional herding cycle, and grows up surrounded by dragon's blood trees and cucumber trees and desert roses that look like nothing anywhere else on earth, while simply being the ordinary, familiar landscape of home. Both of these children also attend school, consume media in Arabic and increasingly in English and other global languages through whatever internet and satellite connectivity the island can support, have mobile phones, and are growing up with awareness of, and aspirations connected to the wider world, in ways that their grandparents never had access to or needed to navigate. This is the fundamental tension of contemporary life on Socotra, as it is for isolated and indigenous communities in many other parts of the world. The negotiation between the genuine value of traditional knowledge, language, culture, and community bonds built across many generations, and the legitimate aspirations of young people for the opportunities, resources, and connections that wider participation in the global economy and culture can offer. The question of what Socotra will look like in 50 or 100 years, both ecologically and culturally, carries enormous stakes. If the island's endemic plants survive the combined pressures of grazing, invasive species, development, and climate change, and if the political situation stabilizes in ways that permit effective conservation governance and sustainable economic development, Socotra's extraordinary natural world has a genuine chance of persisting into the future, continuing to astonish anyone fortunate enough to encounter it. If those pressures compound in the wrong direction, the millions of years of isolated evolution that produced the dragon's blood forests and the cucumber trees and the desert roses could be undone in a timescale measured in decades rather than millennia, an irreversible loss of biological uniqueness with no parallel anywhere on Earth. For the Socotri language and culture, the stakes are similarly significant. If the community succeeds in building educational and cultural programs that value and support the Socotri language alongside Arabic, if the oral traditions of poetry, ecological knowledge, and cultural memory continue to be practiced and transmitted across generations, and if economic development paths can be found that strengthen rather than displace traditional cultural practices, then Socotri identity has genuine resilience and the capacity to carry its remarkable heritage forward.